open our Bibles to the book of Genesis. Let's now open to Genesis chapter 33. Genesis chapter 33, and we will be reading from verse 1 through verse 20. Genesis chapter 33, from verse 1 through verse 20. When you found it, let's all rise together in reverence for God and for the reading of his word. This is the word of God that he speaks to you, so people of God, please hear with open hearts. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two female servants, and he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And last, Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I meet?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please. If I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. Then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go ahead of you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead slowly at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and at a pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." So Esau said, "Let me leave with you some of my people who are with me." But he said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth, and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. There the name of the place is called Succoth. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. On his way to Padan Aram, he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it Elohe Israel. This is God's word, and may God bless you with his word. Many of us who have been following along in the story of Jacob have seen how he had struggled in his long journey. If you remember, Jacob struggled even in his mother's womb. He was struggling and wrestling. And that conflict has been carrying on, and it's been weighing on Joseph's life until the passage that we see today. You see, in Jacob's life, there is now going to be closure. That Jacob is going to find peace with his brother. But we realize It's actually because he knows peace with God. And so we see Jacob's transformation. If you remember, Jacob, he had left his parents because he had stolen his brother's blessing. He tricked his father. He tricked Isaac, and he took advantage of Isaac's blindness. He dressed up like Esau. He pretended to be Esau. He brought the meal like Esau and stole the blessing. And Esau was angry, so angry he was going to kill Jacob. And so Jacob had left. But when he left, God revealed himself to him, and he told him in a vision that God would bless him. God would give Jacob all the promises that he had given to Abraham. And this is where God said to him in Genesis chapter 28, verse 13, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And so Jacob later makes a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. Jacob made a vow. If God would keep his word, then Jacob would consider God as his God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, as also the God of Jacob. But if you notice in Jacob's vow, he had low expectations to a degree. He says basically, if God will be with me, that's something that God promised, but he adds something to it. He says, if God will be with me and keep me in the way that I go, that he will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear. Basically, Jacob is only asking for the bare minimum. That God would just provide him with food and with clothing. That simply that Jacob would not be hungry or naked. He had very low expectations. If God just does that, if God just gives me enough to eat so I don't die of starvation, at least so I'm not that hungry, that I can come back, then he would say that God would be his God. But of course we see God was far, far more gracious. Jacob came back with herds, with servants. And we know that God had been keeping this deal. Jacob made this vow, and this is what he was saying, that God, if you do this for me, then I will say, you are my God. And God has obviously given him enough to eat. This is what Jacob actually says in this passage. I have enough. God has graciously, he's dealt with me graciously. verse 11 of chapter 33. And I have enough. And the first part of his vow, he recognized, God, if you will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, this also God keeps. We saw that when God was dealing with Laban. Jacob tried to deal with Laban, but Jacob was losing. Because no matter how often Jacob would try to make deal after deal, his uncle Laban always had the upper hand, it seemed. But it wouldn't be the case. Because even though the conditions of the deal would keep on favoring Laban and it would be disadvantaging Jacob, God was with Jacob. And God blessed Jacob. And this is what he declared. Jacob knew that he had God with him. And so he tells his wives, it was because God was with us. God blessed him. He recognized that God had been keeping his vow. And today is the last part of that vow. So that I come again to my Father's house in peace. This is the last part of the vow. It's the last clause. Will God keep his side of the bargain? And will Jacob keep his? Jacob lifted up his eyes and he looked. And this reminds us of the prodigal son, does it not? The prodigal son who was lost. And he lifted up his eyes. But you see, who was the one who was lost? Who was the one who is found? It's very interesting. You see that Esau was coming with 400 men. But you notice this time, Jacob is no longer afraid. Instead, Jacob is filled with faith. Because when Jacob was afraid, do you remember what he did? He put everyone in front of him. He tried to make a barrier to protect himself. So he threw everything he had to stop Esau. Because Jacob was very afraid of his brother. But this time, in verse 2 it says, he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. Now you notice his favoritism is already showing. There's only one child who's named out of 12, Joseph. And it's going to lead to more problems in the Holy Family. But in verse 3, he went on before them. Instead of being in the rear, he goes ahead. Instead of going last because of his fear, he goes in front because of faith. Jacob is a changed man. Throughout his whole life, he had to struggle and wrestle. And he was wrestling and wrestling and wrestling, and he was trying to be blessed until he wrestled with God. And until he had to learn what it meant to be humbled before God, to cling to God. And so now he comes to Esau as a humble man. He bows himself down to the ground. Now let me ask you, do you have an older sibling? Have you ever bowed to the ground in front of your older brother or sister? Would you do that if I asked you to? It's, you might do that to someone else you respect, but maybe not your older brother or sister, because, sadly, we need to learn how to forgive. You need to learn how to forgive. Jesus wants us to forgive. But he prostrates himself face down 7 times with a bad hip. And he comes to his brother. But look at Esau's response. Esau is a man of few words. If you remember, in Genesis 25, verse 34, he's very, very simple. He just goes, he eats the stew, and he just walks away. Just quick, just action after action after action. He doesn't really say much. But here, it's the same. He just acts. He doesn't say much. He ran, he embraced, and he fell on his neck. He stoops down, kissed him. Esau was looking for his brother. And if you see the note, they wept. It wasn't just Esau who wept. It wasn't just Jacob who wept. They wept. You see, Esau was not holding on to his grudge as much as Jacob was holding on to his guilt. Esau was not holding on to his anger as much as Jacob was holding on to his fears. But this is something I think we struggle with sometimes. I think we hold on to our fears too tightly. We hold on to our struggles too tightly. We don't realize they're not supposed to be in our grasp. You know why? Because you must learn how to cast your burdens to Jesus. You must learn how to cast all your anxieties to Christ. All of the things that you dread, all of the things in this life that cause you to be uncertain, you would cast them to Christ because you know that He cares for you. You see, that's where Jacob learned freedom, and I think that's where we too must learn how to find freedom. And so Jacob, he is acting in a way to reverse what he did. Remember, he stole the blessing, but now he's trying to give a blessing. And in the blessing that he stole in Genesis chapter 27, verse 29, we see that when Esau was supposed to have been blessed, God was supposed to give him the dew of heaven, the fatness of the earth, plenty of grain and wine, and that Esau had. But in verse 29, this is what it says: let people serve you. This is what Isaac thought he was saying to Esau, but he said to Jacob, let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Jacob is giving this back. He's reversing it. He realizes he did not need to steal Esau's blessing from Isaac, because now Jacob has finally learned that he is blessed by God. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, has been with him. Despite himself, despite that he was Jacob, the heel clutcher. And so now Jacob bows down to his brother 7 times. And even though Esau refers to Jacob as my brother, verse 9, Jacob keeps calling Esau Lord. He's trying to reverse. He's trying to give back what he stole. And so Jacob, if you remember, sent droves of animals, hundreds of animals. And they were meant to be a gift to Esau. And if you remember, if Esau accepted those gifts, then it meant that Esau would accept Jacob. But listen to what Esau says in verse 8. What do you mean by all this company that I meet? Now, if you remember, it was very clear. Jacob was very clear. He told the servants to repeat this message. I'm pretty sure he made them memorize it. Okay, what are you supposed to say when you see Esau? Esau ignores it. He did not accept the gift. He says, "You are my brother." Esau was going to forgive Jacob enough to accept him graciously, without payment. And he says, "Keep what you have for yourself." This is Esau's response. I have enough. You see, all that he really needed was verse 28 of Genesis 27. That God would give the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth. Perhaps we see that Isaac was right in Genesis 27 verse 40, that he lived by the sword, and he lived as a man of war, and he had much because he was very prosperous. Esau does not honor God. He doesn't say, "God gave this to me." But he says, "I just have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." This means that Esau doesn't want the gift. But it also may mean, keep the blessing and the birthright that you stole from me. I don't need it. And there would be not a grudge, but there would be a scar. There would be a hurt between them. But Jacob humbles himself. You see, when Esau says, "What do you mean by all this?" Jacob, he's no longer lying. He doesn't conceal, he says the truth. These are given to find favor in the sight of my Lord. Jacob wants to make sure that there is true reconciliation. Not just bygones be bygones, let's just forget it, so that he could hold it deep down as in the back of his mind, that he would hold on to this. No, what Jacob wanted was actual reconciliation. And he says he is doing this to find favor in the sight of Esau. He urges him. And he says in verse 10, "If I have found favor in your sight," it's not about the gift. It's not, "Do you like these gifts?" No, but if I find favor in your sight, then to accept my gift is to accept me. I've seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God. Esau probably has no idea what kind of night Jacob had. But he's saying, I've seen your face and you have accepted me. And listen to what he says in verse 11. Please accept my gift, my blessing. God bless you. Jacob is trying to restore what he had stolen. And God has been gracious. He's admitting God is being gracious with the heel clutcher. And I have enough. And so Esau took it. Now, in this next section, some of us might have confusion with what's going on. Did Jacob lie again after? It's actually more of a cultural thing. I think for those of you who understand a little bit about Asian culture, you know that if someone who is older than you or someone who has respect tells you to do something, eat that. You don't just say, no, no thanks. That would be rude. Right? If you have someone who's older than you, someone whom you respect, tell you, do this, you would normally do it without question. And if you can't, you have to give a good reason why you don't. And so Jacob has to give excuses. My Lord knows the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care. He has to make excuses. Let my Lord pass on ahead. You see, to directly refuse would be arrogance. It would be disrespectful. Here, Jacob continues to humble himself. Now that Esau has accepted the gifts and he has forgiven his brother, Esau probably recognizes that Jacob is just making excuses and he's refusing. So Esau does not persuade, because if he did, then Jacob would have to accept, but he doesn't. And so Esau returned on his way to Seir. But there is this interesting thing. He goes to Seir, and Jacob goes ultimately to Shechem. So why doesn't Jacob go to Seir? It doesn't say clearly, but we can guess. Because Seir was outside of the promised land. It's not where the 12 tribes would eventually live. Jacob goes to Succoth, and then he goes to Shechem. But if you remember, where's Shechem? What is Shechem? You see, actually, this is the first place that Abraham built his first altar in the promised land. God called Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And God called Abraham, and Abraham responds in faith. And so when Abraham listens, he goes, and if you look in Genesis chapter 12, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Now you see, Jacob goes to Shechem. And there, he doesn't go to Abraham's altar. He does not go to Abraham's altar just to there make a sacrifice and give worship. There, Jacob builds his own altar. And there the name of the altar is Elohei, Israel. Do you know what that name means? God. The God of the God of Israel. The name of the altar is God, the God of Israel. This means that God has kept his vow, part of the deal, so that Jacob would fulfill his vow. He's returned in peace. And now if you notice, he doesn't say, which I slipped, he doesn't say God, the God of Jacob. He says God, the God of Israel. He recognizes that he too has changed. that his life has been transformed because he's been encountered by God, and because he knows God's grace, his life has been changed. And so now he finally declares that God will be his God and that he belongs to God. Do you know this for yourself? Do you know the grace of God in your life so powerfully that your life has been transformed? You see, for Jacob, his life was one of struggle. He was wrestling so hard. He was trying to reach and receive the blessings. But God was gracious, more than gracious. And God blessed him, and his life was changed. He was working and working and working, and finally he came to the point where his life had been changed because he knew of grace. You see, for us, it's reversed. God has given you his grace in Jesus Christ. You see, Jacob was struck when he was wrestling with God. But the way that he was struck, it was mercy. Jacob was trying so hard, but it was to show him what it meant to cling to God. But do you not know that Jesus Christ had to suffer on our behalf? And that when Jesus Christ was suffering, he was not just given a light spanking. He was bruised, yes. And they did their best to bruise him. The soldiers would do their best to bruise him. They would humiliate him. They would call him names. They would spit on him. And Jesus would have to suffer. But his sufferings are not meaningless. It's not empty. He doesn't need to suffer for himself. There's no reason why he needs to carry a cross unless it was our cross. And that's exactly what Jesus does. He carried your cross so that you would be delivered. Jacob wanted enough to eat, but Jesus is the one who gives us the bread of life. And we remember him in the Lord's Supper. He nourishes us. He feeds us with his daily bread. Jacob wanted clothes to wear, but Christ would be disrobed. He would lay his glory aside willingly. He would humble himself so that Christ would clothe you with robes of righteousness. And Jacob finally gets what he was wanting. He has peace with his brother. But do you not know that God gives us peace with himself? That you have peace with God. You have peace with God, and this is what allows us to have this true peace, because Jesus has become for us peace. He is the Prince of Peace. You are delivered. You are saved if you believe in Jesus Christ. But now he calls you to carry the cross, to be united with Jesus in his death, to be united with him in the resurrection. Have you forgotten what it means to follow after Jesus and to carry the cross? Have you forgotten what it means to be crucified with him so that with him you would be raised? Jacob is now transformed to Israel, and he acknowledges it when he builds this altar and he calls it God, the God of Israel, El Elohe Israel. But can you say this? God is the God of me. He's not just the Lord, he's my Lord. He's not just a king, but he is my king, and I will live for him. Let us pray.